Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Today, we are going to discuss mind-body identity theory. We have already discussed behaviorism in this context. Today's discussion will focus on particularly Armstrong's thesis on mind-body identity theory and UT's place famous hypothesis that is consciousness a brain process. So, today we will be discussing about Armstrong at the beginning, and then later we will discuss place hypothesis. Now, let us go to this first statement of Armstrong. One is consciousness a special type of behavior? This is one of the central questions in identity theory. As we have discussed about the behaviorist thesis, behaviorist considers mental states are dispositional states, and mental states cause behaviors. So, behaviors are manifestations of brain states or what they call mental states. Now, mental events are different from psychological or brain events. If they are different from brain events, then the question is, are they causally related to brain events? Meaning thereby, this relationship is it logical relationship or a mere causal relationship. When I say mere causal relationship, then the question is it a contingent identity that Place and Armstrongs are talking about, or is it a logical identity Place and Armstrongs are talking about? So, what kind of identity thesis is being proposed here when they say that mental states are caused by brain processes or consciousness is identical with brain processes. So, looking at these questions about identity, we would be referring to Armstrong's thesis on identity, that is the central state identity theory advocated by Armstrong. Talks about two main important points. One is the physical chemical mechanism and another is the attributive theory of mind. So, Armstrong considers that mind is nothing but a physical chemical mechanism, but he does not totally rule out the concept of mind. What he does is this, that he attributes some kind of quality or properties to the mind, to this entire function, the physico chemical functions that are happening in the brain or entire nervous systems taken into account. So, these are the two important points in Armstrong's central state identity theory. But look at this quotation from Armstrong. Armstrong's this book, A Materialistic Theory of Mind, published in 1968 by Routledge. It goes like this: this is to identify these inner states with physical chemical states of the brain. This is a contingent and scientific identification, and it yields central state materialism. So, Armstrong's thesis on central state theory talks about inner states. What kind of the notion of inner Armstrong is proposing? Is it like the Cartesian theory of inner? According to Armstrong, brain processes are certainly the inner events. Okay, they are not the outer events, they are not given directly to our observations. So, what is directly given to our observations is behavior. Now, they are trying to reject the behaviorist thesis. According to them, behaviorism is not a sound philosophical thesis to talk about human mind. What is important here is that the behaviors are directly caused by certain inner events, and these inner events are of course physical events. because when he talks about the physicochemical processes in the brain or the activities in the central nervous systems. So, the entire process, the bodily mechanisms which are not given to us directly to observe and then talk about its identity. Armstrong is proposing a thesis that these inner states are causally related to the behavior, and when they Armstrong and his followers argue that this causal relationship is possible, what is next? What is the status of mind? Now, they ascribe the mental attributes to the behavior. So, mind as an ontological reality is not part of Armstrong's core agenda. Rather, mind becomes an epiphenomenon for the identity theorist. Now, let us go into the details of this notion of identity that Armstrong is talking about. Now, as I said, the causal relationship between the brain states or the central nervous system and the behavior is a kind of a contingent relationship, because it is not a logical relationship. When I say P and Q are logically related, what I mean is that whenever I talk about Q, the P is presupposed, okay. And so, the P is the necessary and sufficient condition for Q. So, that kind of, and the absence of Q would talk about the absence of P as well. So, this kind of identity, what I call the logical identity thesis, is not strongly advocated by Armstrong as well as by Place. Now, what they talk about is a kind of a contingent identifications. So, what they talk about it is a kind of a contingent identity. Now, what is a contingent identity? Since Armstrong is talking about a scientific hypothesis, he is proposing a scientific hypothesis, then all scientific hypotheses are falsifiable. They are not eternally true. So, we have seen in the case of Descartes and that the transcendental theory of mind, they advocate that mind is eternally true entity. If mind is, or the mental is eternally true, it eternally exists. So, that kind of hypothesis has been rejected by Armstrong. For Armstrong, it is a kind of a contingent identity, that the brain and the mind are contingently related. It is, we can say that, say X is a brain state and X can cause Y. Now, this identity is based on some kind of evidence. Now, we have an evidence for X, okay, causing Y. Now, this relationship will be may not hold true when we talk about, say, Y is caused by K. So, if we have a hypothesis here that pain is caused by the C fiber. Okay. So, whenever C fiber is stimulated, we understand that there is pain. So, C fiber stimulation is causally related to the experience of pain, but it may happen that after few years the neurologist will come out with some other evidences. No, the cause of pain is not only due to the C fiber, maybe it is due to something else. Let us say D fiber is causing pain. So, this kind of revision is entirely possible, and scientific analysis of the notion of mind will hold on to this hypothesis. So, whenever Armstrong or Place will be talking about identity theory, it is a causal identity theory, but not a logical identity theory, meaning thereby the causal identity theory will hold on to the contingent identity, that the inner states are physicochemical states of the brain and these physicochemical states are contingently related with the brain processes. Now, the question that arises here is this: is mind then an epiphenomenon? Because what is the status of mind? Because when I say that the mental is caused by brain processes, look at the whole scenario here. If we say that mental is caused by the brain processes, now what is ontologically real is the brain processes. So, the brain becomes the primary condition of causing the mind. So, now the question is mind an epiphenomenon? Armstrong will not assert on this proposition and say yes, mind is an epiphenomenon. Rather, he does not deny entirely the notion of mind. What he asserts on this, that the scientific understanding of mind is based on certain observable facts. Now, since there are observable evidences shows that certain mental phenomena are caused by brain processes. So, these observable facts, there is a kind of a function, okay, there is some kind of a processes found in the neurological system of human organism, and that may be causing the mental states or behavior. So, therefore, observable facts are to be taken into account, and what is to be taken into account is that there is a kind of a stimulus response theory. Whenever we encounter certain facts, we respond to those facts in a particular way. So, that kind of a causal mechanism they will be talking about. So, what is Armstrong's thesis is this: the certain physical stimuli elicit certain behavior. So, this is kind of a causal chain. Eliciting is a kind of a causal mechanism that would show how brain processes are cause of our behavior. So, that is a kind of a thesis which Armstrong would propose. Armstrong will not deny entirely that there is nothing called mind. Okay. So, for him saying that mind is an epiphenomenon probably not correct. So, that will be my suggestions, because he talks about an attributive theory of mind. Mind is attributed to this whole processes, okay, saying that experience, imagination, etc. are mental phenomena, and they are attributed to the brain processes. Now, let us go further and see Armstrong's argument. Now, the central state materialism or central state identity theory holds that when we are aware of mental states, let us say when we are experiencing mental states or thinking something, what we are aware of are mere physical states of the brain, but we are not certainly aware of mental states as brain states. So, there is a mechanism which is going on, and we are not aware of this mechanism. What we are aware of the facts that we are thinking something, let us say I am thinking about my lectures, okay, I am conscious of what I am saying, or I am conscious of my students looking at me and listening to these lectures. So, these conscious experiences or awareness is what I am directly concerned with, what I can directly conscious of. But what is important here is to examine the thesis that there is something going on behind all this experience of mind, all this awareness of mind, and that is what Armstrong calls an inner process. Inner for him does not mean that this inner is a mental process. Inner here means a kind of a brain processes which are not observable directly, which are not experienced directly, which are not known directly. So, in that sense the concept of inner has to be revised within this framework of the central state materialism. So, materialism will hold on to the ontological thesis of matter. For him, the mind is not ontologically prior to the mentor. Probably the mind is caused by the matter. So, that kind of thesis has to be considered when we talk about an identity theory in a typical case of identity theory of for X kind of behavior, Y is the cause. So, that kind of identity at a micro level is possible. So, now then the question arises, when he talks about inner processes, these inner processes are unconscious processes. We are not conscious of this fact that unconscious mental states are real, because when I say I am experiencing all of you sitting there before me and listening to my lectures. Now, this idea of consciousness is so self evident in the case of Descartes, or so self evidently available to us, is not considered something very significant in the case of Armstrong. Armstrong says these brain processes, which are inner reality to all our behaviors, to all our actions, is something unconscious. They are not conscious behaviors. So, probably Armstrong's thesis is this, that the unconscious mental states correspond to the neurological structure of the brain. Now, this idea one has to look at, because neurological processes in the brain are entirely unconscious. So, and that would give to some kind of a synthesis, I would say, that Armstrong is trying to bring out when he talks about an attributive theory of mind and psychophysical mechanism that are going on behind the whole process of the mental, what we call the mental or the voluntary behavior. So, Armstrong is not rejecting entirely the mind. Armstrong in fact gives a kind of a weak thesis of identity, I would say, when I would compare him with UT Place thesis on identity. So, in that context, Armstrong is drawing a synthesis between the existence of the mind and the existence of the brain processes, and how these two are related in the hypothesis called the central state identity theory. Now, let us go to look at what is UT Place major concern. Now, UT Place, as we all know, is advocating a hypothesis, consciousness is a brain process. Now, this hypothesis is one of the major breakthrough in the discourse of philosophy of mind. UT Place famous hypothesis published in the British Journal of Psychology 1956, and Place holds on to his hypothesis and writes another paper published in Australasian Journal of Philosophy in 1988, and this article corresponds to the previous one, says 30 years on is consciousness still a brain process. The previous article is titled as is consciousness a brain process. So, after 30 years, unfortunately, UT Place passed away in 2004. UT Place paper, is consciousness a brain process, is a major breakthrough in the discourse of philosophy of mind, because the scientific understanding of mind is based on this simple hypothesis, and UT Place is trying to locate what kind of identity theory philosophers are holding. Is it just a logical identity theory? Does the logical identity theory presuppose certain scientific facts? I mean, does it have any connection with the scientific facts? So, that is Place's major concern, I would say. So, look at the main concern of Place. I have tried to capture it in this quotation. He says, the question I wish to raise is whether in making this assumption, as assuming that brain processes cause consciousness, let us assume that that is true, and then he says we are inevitably committed to the dualistic position. The moment you say that the brain is causing the mind or consciousness, then you are committed to a dualistic notion of mind or a dualistic theory of mind. Now, this dualistic position in which sensation and mental images from a separate category of processes over and above the physical and the physiological processes with which they are known to be correlated. So, what is important is that the moment you talk about x is causing y and y here is a mental phenomenon and caused by x, which is a brain process, then you are already caught in the circle of dualism, the kind of dualism probably Descartes is initiating. And we all know that Descartes is committing a kind of a mistake, what Ryle calls a category mistakes. So, this assumption that x causing y, the mind is caused by brain processes, and putting them in two separate categories, say x and y, is a problematic thesis. So, we need to look at this thesis more closely, whether this thesis is based on certain observable facts or it is a kind of a mere logical assumption. That is what is plays main concern, that over and above this process, the physical and the physiological processes with which they are known to be correlated. So, we need to correlate the mental with the physical, and what kind of correlation he is talking about. Now, that will be very clear when we look at the nature of the hypothesis. The nature of the hypothesis says consciousness is a process in the brain. In my view, is neither self contradictory nor self evident. So, it is not self evident as Descartes is proposing. So, therefore, he says it is a reasonable scientific hypothesis, meaning thereby a reasonable scientific hypothesis may be falsifiable, okay, based on certain new evidences, that if a new evidence shows us that the mental is not caused by brain processes, then it is fine. Probably that will revise the kind of hypothesis that Place and other neuroscientists or other materialistic theories of mind are talking about. That will certainly revise their hypothesis. But so far as Place thesis is concerned, what Place is pleading for is this, that we need to find out the correlation, and that is very important challenge for all of us. And the neuroscience is progressing today based on this hypothesis or based on this assumption that there are certain sectors in the brain, there are certain places in the brain which are causing mental phenomena. So, that is something we need to talk about. One can say hypothalamus is the central part of the brain which is causing consciousness. That is the recent thesis probably Searle would talk about, and in fact, Searle's biological naturalism holds on to this hope that consciousness can be explained by brain processes. We would definitely look at Searle's theory of consciousness little later in our class. But what is important here is this, that this hypothesis in a way is based on certain scientific analogy. Analogy are certainly important to talk about scientific proof. Analogies are drawn here with a reference to lightning is a motion of electric charges, like brain or consciousness is caused by brain processes. Now, this kind of hypothesis is analogous to the hypothesis that lightning is nothing but a motion of electric charges. So, that is a kind of a analogy Place is trying to draw here. is a reasonable scientific hypothesis according to UT Place. Now, what are the main arguments Place is having? Now, the main arguments are mind brain identity is not a logical identity, but an empirical theory or a empirical identity based on the scientific evidences. Number 2, brain processes cannot be dismissed on logical grounds. To say that I am aware of my experiences, my dreams, imaginations, etc., are self evidently true, and this self evidence is something very personal and private to my consciousness, is ruled out. So, we cannot just say they are logical, rather we have to prove that they hold a kind of an identity with reference to the scientific evidence. So, that is the hypothesis mainly talking about. So, inner process therefore, does not entail dualism. So, whenever the identity theory talks about the notion of inner, they do not really talk about the way the Cartesians talk about the notion of inner. Probably the concept of inner needs to be little modified here and understood. Inner means that which is not directly observable. In that sense, inner has to be taken. I mean, as I have already talked about it. Now, we need to reflect that how Place go about this hypothesis. Now, look at the definition of Place. Place says the notion of ease here is something very important. Now, ease here is in the sense of definition or in the sense of composition. So, there are two senses in which we can talk about the notion of ease, that say consciousness is brain processes. Now, in what sense this ease is been used? That is what we need to look at. Is it used in the definitional sense, or is something which composes its predicate? Say for example, if I say red is color, that is the example she gives, red is a color. Here color is a predicate that defines the subject. Whenever we say that red is a color, but nothing else, if I say red is a color, but nothing else, probably this I would take in a definitional sense, because that color which is a predicate here necessarily defines the subject red. So, in that sense it will be a kind of a definitional notion of predicate, because I am saying red is a color, but nothing else. If I say this, then and go back to the hypothesis, that is consciousness is a brain process. This is the hypothesis that Place is drawing here. If I go to that hypothesis, then I find Place is using it in the sense of definition. Now, then what is been drawn here? This says that they are necessarily identical. These two say are necessarily identical, C and B are necessarily identical, or they are contingently identical, because necessary identity will talk about reductionism, that brain is necessarily related with consciousness, or in other way we will talk about reductionism. Place is very much aware of this, but in Place theoretical framework there is no reductionism, though Place talks about identity. Therefore, he says the statements about sensation and mental images are reducible or analyzable in the statements about brain processes. Certainly, there are people who talk about this kind of thesis, but place identity thesis does not talk about this kind of reductionism. Rather, about definition, he says the identity between the statement of consciousness and the statement of brain processes is manifestly false. It is manifestly false because it has not achieved what it was supposed to achieve, and therefore, it is manifestly false. Now, what it is supposed to gain? What place hypothesis is intending to prove here is our major concern. Now, the main concern here is this, that is should be used in a definitional sense and is also is used in a compositional sense. Now, as I mentioned about the statement red is a color, is a definitional sense here. Red is a color, color is a predicate, and he says that a square is a equilateral rectangle is another kind of a definition. A square is a equilateral rectangle. This is a kind of a definition he is trying to now pose. In a compositional sense, what kind of composition that he is talking about? Now, in a compositional sense, he says that her hat is bundle of straw tied together with string. Her hat is a bundle of straw tied together with string. Now, this here is used in the sense of compositions, in the sense of composition. Now, his table is not an old packing case, is also used in the sense of composition. So, now look at this analysis of the nature of is. Say for example, if x is p and nothing else, is used in the sense of prediction. Say for example, if I say water is H2O, whether I am trying to use this term is in the sense of predication or in the sense of composition. There are two ways in which now we can use the term is. So, another is if I say P is Q, man is rational or man is say biped. There are two ways in which is can be used. So, in the sense of composition and the sense of predication. The necessary statement when I say man is rational or water is H2O, then is used in the sense of identity, that is water is necessarily H2O having the properties like 2 molecules of hydrogen and 1 molecule of oxygen. So, that necessarily defines what water is all about. So, Place argues that giving this statement square is an equilateral rectangle, and she compares with another statement, it should be n, her table is an old packing case. Now, in the latter case you find the second statement here is about giving the sense of composition, whereas the first one gives us the impression of identity. If P and Q, water and H2O are the subject and predicate term, then both are necessarily related, that is one thing. The necessary relation suggests that wherever there is Q, P is present, and whenever Q is absent, P is also absent. So, in that sense the concept of necessity is to be defined. So, Place argues that is, when is used in the case of a definition, it is used in the sense of a necessary conditions. the kind of predication which has been used to talk about water or talk about consciousness shows that the necessary statement talks about some kind of a identity between the subject and the predicate. So, in that sense Place is trying to prove his hypothesis that consciousness is brain process. So, it is not a contingent statement, rather it is a necessary statement, because had it been a contingent statement, it would have been false. If somebody else says no, consciousness is not caused by brain processes, it is caused by some other function of the organism. So, let us say palpitation causes consciousness. If somebody argues that, then this could be treated as a contingent statement, not a necessary statement. So, then we need to really define, look at in what sense Place is talking about this identity or defining the necessity. Place argues, and her argument is as follows, that there is a relationship between the meaning of the expression forming the grammatical predicate and the meaning of the term forming the grammatical subject, such that whenever the subject term is applicable, the predicate must also be applicable. So, as I mentioned earlier, that whenever I talk about the presence of Q or H2O in the case of water, I also suggest that corresponding to this predicate, we have also the presence of the subject. So, in that sense, we are talking about some kind of a grammatical subject and a grammatical predicate. So, the subject predicate relationship, or when we say that consciousness is brain process. So, this is what according to Place is a kind of a grammatical predicate ascribed to the subject term, say consciousness. And whenever we talk about their necessary relationship, we say that the grammatical subject is available along with the grammatical predicate, or whenever we talk about the grammatical predicate, then the grammatical subject is presupposed. So, in that sense, the kind of meaning they generate is nothing but a kind of a necessary relationship between the subject term and the predicate term. So, what we can conclude from this thesis is this, that the meaning of these expressions must not be logically unconnected. When you say that consciousness and brain processes are two unconnected terms, that is what Place will not accept. In fact, they are logically connected with each other. So, Place tries to draw our attention to this fact that this hypothesis that consciousness is a brain processes projects or proves this fact that we cannot sideline the notion of brain processes when we are talking about consciousness. Rather, consciousness is always there with reference to the brain processes. That kind of connection is a logical connection, and according to Place, they are not logically unconnected events. They are not logically unconnected because they talk about ontological dependency. Place in her thesis suggests that consciousness is ontologically dependent on brain processes. So, there are not two different ontologies. Okay. Rather, the notion of consciousness is ascribed to the brain processes. So, therefore, it is very important to talk about whether Place hypothesis talks about any kind of a logical independency, or Place hypothesis talks about ontological dependency. Now, this is the major question which follows from the debate whether consciousness is caused by brain processes. Now, the Place writes, I quote, "If we lived in the world in which all tables without exception were packing cases, then the concept of table and packing cases in our language would not have their present logically independent status. So, Place gives a kind of a linguistic analysis of this case when he talks about the subject term and predicate term relationship. The linguistic analysis shows that how a term is defined within the framework of a language or language use. Is it the case that when we define the concept of table, stating that her table is a pecking case, is the pecking case always used as a predicate to define the subject table? That is the question which Place is referring to. How a particular term is used and what kind of meaning it generates when it is being used. So, that is Place main concern, because as we know Place is arguing this thesis, particularly Wittgenstein and many others in philosophy of language are talking about a used theory of meaning. The used theory of meaning suggests that language has a meaning, or the meaning of a particular term could be understood with reference to its use in a particular context. So, what is important for the later Wittgensteinian is this, that language use goes along with form of life. People who have read Wittgenstein must be aware of this fact, that whenever Wittgenstein talks about a language use or what he calls language game, then the language game is associated with forms of life. So, language game and forms of life are logically connected. So, when Place argues that when we talk about table, and table can be defined as a kind of a pecking case, then is it the case that when we talk about pecking case, we talk about table, or when we talk about table, it can necessarily supposes that we will be talking about the pecking case. So, that kind of logical relationship Place is trying to draw, and it is argued in the background of the used theory of meaning. So, taking language into the entire discourse where identity statements can be analyzed. Let us look at the notion of identity from the point of view of observational facts. So, you have observational facts, like when you talk about table, we talk about pecking case. Similarly, in a scientific framework, when we talk about say water is H2O, then we certainly look for an observational fact, whether in every case that we talk about water, there we find now 2 molecules of hydrogen and 1 molecule of oxygen. Is it the case? So, a scientific case is to be proved with reference to observations. What are the observational conditions which can say or which can suggest to us that there is a kind of a logical dependency between brain processes and consciousness. Place gives an example, and look at this quotation of Place. A cloud is large semi-transparent mass with fleshy structure suspended in the atmosphere, whose shape is subject to continual and kaleidoscopic change. Whenever we imagine notion of cloud, or whenever we talk about the notion of cloud, then we define cloud with reference to certain observational facts, that it is a kind of a fleshy structure suspended in in the atmosphere, whose space is subject to continuous kaleidoscopic change. So, that is what Place talks about an observational facts with reference to cloud. But observation of what? It says, then it says, what do we observe? We observe mass of tiny particles, water droplets, and continuous motions. So, these are the things we find available when we talk about observations. So, being cloud must correspond to these observational facts. If it is not corresponding to the observational facts, then probably we will suggest that this is not cloud, or this is something else, this is fog or whatever. So, there are so many interpretations one can draw. So, observational relationship is important when we talk about logical dependency or logical independency. If you say that water is constituted of H2O, then we must have observational facts corresponding to these statements. If we say that the table is always about the packing case, then that kind of use must be there in our language. So, our use of a particular term table must correspond to the packing case. So, this is also one kind of an observational facts, like we talk about the clouds, we explain the notion of cloud. So, in that sense, so this observational relationship has to be invariably associated with each other. Now, whenever we talk about causal relationship, that water H2O, consciousness brain processes, or table and packing case, if whenever we talk about this kind of relationships, what place called a logical relationship, then these logical relationships are based on certain observational facts. And as you know, observational facts are talking about causal relationships. When I say H2O causes water, water is constituted of H2O, then this is a kind of a causal relationship that Place will be talking about, because Place wants to give a scientific understanding of consciousness. So, their scientific explanations not only depends on the observational facts, but how these observational facts constitute another fact. That is important here. So, in this regard, we need to look at the causal relationship of the micro elements of the water, or the causal relationship between consciousness or the neural structures in the brains and the psychochemical processes which happens in the brain, and how they cause consciousness or conscious experiences, sensations and after images. So, there is a long debate this identity theorists are holding, right from Armstrong, as I mentioned. Armstrong, Place, to great extent J.C.C. Smart, who is also trying to give an explanation of sensation with reference to brain processes. So, all these identity theorists are depending on the causal analysis or causal explanation of consciousness. So, in that sense they talk about a kind of a invariable associations between the two. If x and y, say x and y are invariably related, whenever x is there, y is also there, or whenever y is there, x is also there. So, that kind of a causal relationship or invariable relationship or association is necessary to talk about a scientific explanation of the hypothesis. Two sets of observations that Place is talking about. The case of compositions where lightning is like the motion of electric charges, or lightning determines the occurrence of electric charges. So, there are two things one can think of. One, if I say H2O determines what water is, and H2O composes water. So, in that sense look at the terminology, x determines the existence of y. If I talk about x, x determines the existence of y. So, y is in fact occurring out of the x. Therefore, x becomes a determining factor of y. Place is talking about a kind of a determining factor. So, and the kind of a invariable correlationship, and gives an example of say moon and tide. Okay. So, whenever we talk about the rays of moon, moon is rising and the level of tide is also rising. So, this kind of leveling example is used to talk about correlations, how they are causally correlated with each other. And in the case of a scientific facts, we need to talk about a technical observations. Okay. A set of connections, if we would like to determine, then probably we will be using scientific apparatus to observe certain facts. So, that is that kind of things place is interested to bring in when we talk about the identity theory or to prove the hypothesis. He says there is a physiological explanations. How does we talk about observation or introspective observations? Talking about sensation, talking about after images, place would go in favor of her thesis that there is a kind of a mental dispositional factor, and that is responsible for causing these after images or sensations, along with Smart and Armstrong. So, place example of proving the hypothesis will depend on the chain of events. So, that is very important, the chain of events, the occurrence of this chain of events, along with when we have a particular sensation in the mind, that I am now place gives this example. So, whenever we have a sensation, we must see what kind of events are occurring in the brain, that will explain the sensation, mental sensation. Place is drawing this from Sherrington's nature of events. Sherrington in 1947 write this, the integrative action of nervous system, okay, where he talks about two types of events. One is the physicochemical events, another is the psychical events. So, Davidson in one of his papers talks about mental events. So, I am sure you will take interest in reading Davidson's thesis of mental events, how mental events can be described with reference to certain physical events in the body. So, Davidson to some extent does not eliminate the physical events, the psychophysical events or the dispositional capacities and its causal relationship with the behavior. Davidson does not rule out that. What Place is trying to show here, drawing a thesis from Sherrington, that there are two kinds of events. One is the physicochemical events and another is the psychical events. But then Place is also apprehensive of a kind of a mistake, whether we are talking about what he called phenomenological fallacy. The logical mistake that Place is apprehensive of, one is this, that is the mistake of supposing that when a subject describes his experience, when he describes how things look, sounds, taste or feel to him, he is describing the literal properties of the objects and events on the particular sort of internal cinema or a television screen, usually referred to the modern psychological literature as phenomenological field. So, now as I have mentioned earlier that Descartes is giving a representational theory of mind. The mind is a kind of a inner chamber, okay, where everything that is given to the mind is represented in a particular way. So, that kind of thesis Descartes is talking about, and whenever one is giving a description of things that he is or she is experiencing. Now, these descriptions are nothing but how things are represented in my mind. So, is there a mind that represents things? Okay. So, Place is trying to attack the kind of representational thesis which Descartes is arguing. The Cartesian mind which represents things is not necessarily a kind of a ontologically real, but what is ontologically real is the brain mechanism, the psychophysical mechanism of the brain, and that creates and gives us representations. So, our description of our experiences are due to the brain processes that is there going on in our brain. So, Place will not talk about the kind of representational thesis which is argued by Descartes and some of the followers of Descartes. Let us summarize Place's thesis in this way, that Place along with Armstrong and Smart, those I did not discuss Smart here, but I am sure those who are reading the identity theories, they would also like to read Jessie Smart. Please does refer to Smart in her paper. Smart says sensation and brain processes, that is one of Smart's paper. There also talks about how brain processes is an important factor giving or exhibiting the behavior. So, Place tries to prove the scientific hypothesis, which is a kind of a major established thesis so far, and this hypothesis I think is still a kind of a correct hypothesis when Place revisits it after 30 years and writes another paper 30 years on consciousness is a brain process. So, that shows how Place hypothesis is still working. If somebody wants to read identity theory, one cannot eliminate Place as a hypothesis. One has to study Place hypothesis very seriously in order to talk about functionalism, in order to talk about the neuroscientific or the philosophical understanding of neuroscience or consciousness. With this, I will conclude the discussion on identity theory.